Here's a genuinely strange situation playing out inside Microsoft's own house right now. The company built a tool specifically so Windows users could run real Linux directly inside Windows, without dual booting, without a virtual machine, without leaving the Windows ecosystem at all. It's called the Windows Subsystem for Linux, or WSL, and millions of developers depend on it every single day. And over the past year, Microsoft has broken it, not once, at least twice, in 2 separate updates with 2 separate networking failures, each one cutting developers off from the servers and remote systems their actual jobs depend on. That would be a strange enough story on its own. But it's happening at the exact same moment Microsoft's own Windows chief tried to tell developers that Windows was evolving into an agentic OS, and got hit with one of the angriest, most direct developer backlashes in the platform's history in response. This is the story of a company that keeps breaking the one tool built to keep developers from leaving, while simultaneously telling those same developers that the future of Windows is more AI, not more reliability. And it's worth watching this specific tension closely because it's a genuinely unusual position for a company to find itself in. It's worth sitting with a timeline for a second before diving into the specifics, because the sequencing here is what makes this story land differently than a simple bug report would. November 2025, Microsoft's Windows leadership publicly frames the platform's future around AI agents and gets an immediate hostile developer response. December 2025 and January 2026. 2 separate Windows updates break the exact WSL functionality developers rely on for remote server and VPN access. March 2026. Microsoft publicly commits to improving WSL specifically, in language that omits the one complaint developers have been most vocal about. June 2026. Microsoft's own team has to publicly correct confusion about what it actually announced regarding WSL's future. 4 separate moments across 8 months, all touching the exact same nerve, and every one of them reinforcing the same underlying question. Does Microsoft actually understand, or care, what the developers, keeping Windows relevant in a Linux-dominated infrastructure world, actually need from it? Let's start with what WSL actually is, because it matters for understanding why breaking it is such a big deal. Windows Subsystem for Linux lets you run an actual Linux environment. Real Linux commands, real Linux tools, real Linux kernel in its more advanced version, directly inside Windows, without needing to dual boot into a separate operating system or spin up a full virtual machine. For developers, that's enormously useful, because so much of the modern software world runs on Linux underneath the hood anyway. Servers, cloud infrastructure, containers, deployment pipelines. WSL lets a developer keep using Windows as their daily driver while still working in an environment that closely matches the Linux servers their code will eventually run on. It's one of Microsoft's genuinely well-regarded developer tools, praised for years as proof that Microsoft was taking Linux compatibility seriously instead of treating it as an afterthought. It's worth remembering how significant WSL's original arrival actually was, because it says something about how much reputational goodwill has been sitting on the line here. When Microsoft first introduced WSL back in 2016, it represented a genuine philosophical shift for a company that had spent decades treating Linux as a competitor to be fought, rather than a platform worth supporting directly. A senior Microsoft executive at the time was widely quoted, joking that Microsoft loved Linux, a line that would have sounded almost absurd from that same company a decade earlier, given Microsoft's history of hostility toward open source software throughout the 1990s and 2000s. WSL's steady improvement over the following years, a full Linux kernel with WSL2, official Microsoft Store distribution, and eventually open sourcing the majority of its code, became one of the clearest, most frequently cited pieces of evidence that Microsoft's relationship with Linux had genuinely changed for the better. That's exactly why the current pattern of breakage lands as such a letdown rather than just routine frustration. WSL wasn't some neglected afterthought product to begin with. It was held up repeatedly as proof that Microsoft had learned to take Linux compatibility seriously. A tool with that much accumulated goodwill breaking twice in 2 months costs more credibility than an equivalent failure in a less symbolically important product would. That's exactly what makes the last year of WSL's history so frustrating for the people who depend on it. In December 2025, Microsoft released a Windows 11 update, KB 5067036, intended to improve functionality, performance, and reliability across the platform. Instead, it introduced a serious networking failure specifically affecting WSL's mirrored networking feature. The exact functionality developers rely on to access virtual private servers and maintain stable connections between their Windows machine and Linux-based remote systems. For anyone using WSL to connect to a VPS for testing, deployment, or remote development work, that update meant their workflow simply stopped working, with no warning and no advance notice that this specific functionality was at risk. That wasn't an isolated incident either. Just 1 month earlier, in January 2026, a separate Windows update had already broken. WSLs mirrored networking in a different way, producing no route to host errors that specifically prevented developers from reaching internal corporate resources over VPN connections while working remotely. Think about what that actually means in practice. Developers working from home, trying to connect through their company's VPN to internal systems, suddenly finding that the specific Microsoft-built tool meant to make that exact workflow seamless had stopped working correctly, with the failure traced directly back to a Windows update that was supposed to be routine. For anyone whose job depends on that kind of remote access, working reliably every single day, that's not a minor annoyance to shrug off. It's a direct hit to their ability to do their job at all until a workaround or fix arrives. 2 separate networking failures in 2 consecutive updates, both hitting the exact same core functionality developers depend on to do real work. That's not the kind of pattern that reads as bad luck. It reads as a testing process that isn't catching WSL-specific regressions before they ship update after update, even though WSL has existed as a serious, heavily marketed developer tool for close to a decade at this point. It's worth being fair to Microsoft here because the full picture matters. WSL is a genuinely complex piece of engineering, running a real Linux kernel inside a lightweight virtual machine with a dynamic IP address that changes on every restart, creates inherent networking complexity that's difficult to get right under every possible configuration, across the enormous range of corporate VPN setups, home router configurations, and cloud provider networking rules that real-world developers actually use. Microsoft didn't ignore these bugs either. Both were eventually acknowledged and addressed through subsequent patches. This isn't a story about a company that doesn't care about WSL at all. It's a story about a company whose testing process keeps failing to catch serious regressions in this specific tool before they reach real developers doing real work, 2 times in as many months, in ways that specifically break the exact use cases, remote server access, VPN connectivity, that make WSL valuable in a professional context in the first place. Here's where the story gets more interesting, because it's not just about bugs anymore. In March 2026, Microsoft's Windows chief, Pavan Davuluri, published a blog post specifically promising improvements to what he called elevating the Windows Subsystem for Linux experience, committing to better performance, reliability, and integration for developers using Linux tools inside Windows. On the surface, that reads like exactly the right response. Acknowledge the pain points, commit to fixing them. But look closer at how that commitment has been received by people who actually cover this space closely, and a very different interpretation starts to emerge. One detailed analysis of Microsoft's WSL roadmap, published around Microsoft's Build 2026 Developer Conference, described the entire push in blunt terms. Not really a concession to open source at all, but a strategic lock-in maneuver executed with better manners than Microsoft has historically shown. The logic behind that read is worth spelling out plainly because it's a sharp piece of analysis. If Microsoft can make Linux-based development workflows feel completely native and frictionless inside Windows, it never actually has to win an argument about why Windows is better than Linux on its own merits. It just has to make leaving Windows feel unnecessary, solving the exact problem that's been pushing developers toward Linux and macOS for years, without ever addressing the underlying reasons developers wanted to leave in the first place. The USL's improvements, under that reading, aren't generosity toward the Linux community. They're a retention strategy aimed squarely at keeping developers inside Microsoft's ecosystem, dressed up in the language of open source goodwill. That interpretation gets a lot more credible when you look at what Microsoft actually announced at Build 2026 alongside those WSL promises. The company unveiled something initially reported by multiple outlets as WSL 3, only for Microsoft's own WSL product manager to publicly correct the record weeks later, clarifying that there is no WSL 3, and that what had actually been announced was a separate feature called WSL containers, letting developers run Linux containers directly inside Windows without needing third-party tools. That correction itself is a small but telling detail. Even the tech press covering Microsoft's own announcement about improving Linux support inside Windows got the basic facts wrong, in a way that suggests the messaging around this initiative has been muddled from the very beginning. It's worth sitting with how that confusion actually happened, because it's a useful window into how Microsoft's Linux-facing announcements tend to get communicated. Build 2026 covered a genuinely significant amount of ground in a short window: GPU and NPU access for WSL workloads, a new container platform with its own CLI, API, and SDK, and improvements to file system performance that developers had been requesting for years. In the rush to cover all of it, multiple outlets conflated the container feature with a full version bump, assuming a rebrand that never actually happened. Microsoft's own team eventually had to step in publicly to correct the record, but by then the WSL3 framing had already spread across headlines and social media discussion for weeks. Whether that mix-up reflects genuinely unclear internal messaging from Microsoft, or simply the tech press moving faster than accuracy allowed, the net effect was the same. A program that's supposed to be rebuilding developer trust in WSL's reliability generated its first wave of coverage built on a factual error nobody at Microsoft had bothered to head off in advance. There's also a detail buried in that March 2026 WSL commitment that's worth calling out directly, because it's exactly the kind of quiet omission this channel keeps finding across completely different Microsoft products. DeVulery's blog post promised improvements across 4 specific areas of the WSL experience. It did not mention the mandatory Microsoft account sign-in requirement, a persistent, frequently cited point of developer frustration that predates both of the networking bugs we just covered. Developers have been vocal for a long time about wanting the option to use WSL and Windows more broadly, without being funneled into creating and signing into a Microsoft account just to use functionality that used to work with a simple local account. A blog post explicitly framed as addressing developer pain points, published by the executive directly responsible for Windows, simply left that specific, well-documented complaint completely unaddressed. Whether that's a deliberate omission or a genuine oversight, the practical effect is the same. The one piece of friction developers keep asking Microsoft to remove is exactly the one piece nobody at Microsoft has committed to changing. Now, let's connect this to the moment that actually explains why this WSL story lands so much harder than it otherwise would. In November 2025, just a few months before that first WSL networking bug even hit, Davuluri posted on social media promoting an upcoming Microsoft Ignite session, describing Windows as evolving into an agentic OS, connecting devices, cloud, and AI to unlock intelligent productivity and secure work anywhere. It was meant to be routine conference promotion. It turned into one of the most visibly hostile developer reactions Microsoft has faced on social media in years. The replies were not measured criticism. They were, by multiple accounts, an overwhelming wave of anger from developers and power users specifically, people who described themselves as having used Windows for their entire professional lives, expressing genuine frustration that Microsoft's stated direction for the platform's future centered on AI agents rather than the reliability, performance, and basic day-to-day usability problems they'd been reporting for years. One commenter, in a reply that later got widely quoted across multiple outlets covering the backlash, laid out in specific detail which machines in their own household they were planning to migrate away from Windows entirely. Several desktop machines moving to Linux, servers moving to Linux-based virtualization, with only a single work laptop and a gaming PC staying on Windows out of necessity rather than preference. That's not an abstract complaint about branding. That's a real person describing a real, already in progress migration plan posted directly in response to Microsoft's own promotional content, and it was far from an isolated reaction. The backlash grew large enough and hostile enough that Davuluri disabled replies on the original post entirely, a decision plenty of observers read as an attempt to shut down criticism rather than engage with it, especially given that a meaningful share of the people replying were exactly the technically sophisticated developers and power users Microsoft would ordinarily want to keep listening to, not silence. Davuluri did eventually post a follow-up response acknowledging the feedback, describing the team as taking in a ton of feedback, and mentioning awareness of concerns around reliability, performance, and ease of use. But that follow-up was widely criticized as vague and non-committal. It offered no specific roadmap, no concrete timeline, and notably, no direct engagement with the sharpest concerns raised. Worries about system bloat, hardware lock-in, and the sense that flashy Copilot integrations kept arriving before Microsoft had fixed long-standing, more basic reliability problems. It's worth noting how the backlash didn't stay contained to a single social media post either, which is part of why it's fair to describe this as a genuine crisis moment rather than an isolated bad day online. A parallel discussion on Reddit, involving some of the same influential voices from the developer community, generated a similarly negative reaction, spreading the criticism across multiple platforms rather than letting it die out in one contained thread. And notably, when Davuluri disabled replies on his original post, a number of frustrated users responded not by moving on, but by reposting the original message themselves, attaching even sharper criticism than before, treating the decision to cut off replies as confirmation that Microsoft was more interested in managing the appearance of the backlash than actually listening to it. That's a genuinely difficult dynamic for any company to recover from quickly, because it transforms a single controversial post into an ongoing, self-sustaining conversation about whether the company is even willing to hear the criticism in the first place. Put those two threads together, and the picture becomes genuinely stark. In the same roughly 6-month window, Microsoft's Windows leadership publicly signaled that AI agents were the platform's future direction, triggering a backlash sharp enough to require disabling replies, and then, twice, shipped updates that broke the exact developer-facing Linux tool Microsoft simultaneously claims to be investing in improving. If you were a developer already frustrated by the sense that Windows was drifting away from what technical users actually needed, watching WSL, the one tool built specifically to keep you inside the Windows ecosystem, break not once, but twice in a matter of months, is exactly the kind of experience that turns abstract dissatisfaction into an actual decision to leave. It's worth understanding a bit more about what actually provoked that level of anger, because Agentic OS is a vague enough phrase that the backlash might seem disproportionate without more context. The broader vision Microsoft has been building toward publicly involves AI agents that don't just respond to direct requests the way Copilot originally did, but act more autonomously on a user's behalf, anticipating needs, automating multi-step tasks, and integrating deeply across the operating system and cloud services. For a lot of developers and power users, that vision raised immediate and specific concerns that go well beyond simple AI skepticism. Worries about AI agents having broad access to read files and monitor on-screen activity in order to function. Concerns about where exactly the boundary sits between helpful automation and constant surveillance of your own machine, and a broader unease about a platform that's spent the last few years steadily increasing telemetry, account requirements, and background AI processes, now explicitly committing to expand all three simultaneously. Framed that way, the backlash reads less like reflexive anti-AI sentiment and more like a specific, informed reaction to a specific set of privacy and control trade-offs that a lot of technical users were not on board with. There's also a useful piece of recent WSL history worth mentioning here, because it shows Microsoft's relationship with the open source community around this tool has genuinely had real substance behind it, which frustrating rather than less. In May 2025, Microsoft open sourced the majority of WSL, releasing its code publicly, rather than keeping it as a closed proprietary layer bolted onto Windows. That's a real meaningful gesture. It wasn't purely symbolic, and it gave the broader development community actual visibility into how WSL works under the hood, along with the ability to contribute fixes directly, rather than simply reporting bugs into a closed system and waiting. That history matters because it means the recent networking failures aren't happening inside some opaque black box Microsoft controls with zero outside visibility. They're happening in a code base the community can actually inspect coming doubt, and even with that transparency, the same category of networking regression has shipped twice in as many months, which says something about the pace and thoroughness of Microsoft's own internal testing process, rather than a lack of community goodwill or access. It's worth being fair to the broader context here too, because Microsoft isn't uniquely bad at software reliability, and every large, complex operating system ships bugs. But the specific pattern matters. This isn't a random, unrelated bug in some obscure corner of Windows. It's the same core WSL networking functionality, breaking twice in 2 months inside the exact tool Microsoft has publicly and repeatedly promised to prioritize, at the exact moment the company's own leadership was facing a credibility crisis over whether it actually understood what developers wanted from the platform at all. That combination, public promises, repeated technical failures in the specific area those promises covered, and a leadership response widely criticized as evasive, is a pattern this channel has now documented across Teams, Secure Boot, WordPad, Copilot's Broken Edge sidebar, and now WSL. Each individual incident has its own specific technical cause, but the shape keeps repeating. A product or feature relevant to Linux adjacent user ships in a degraded state, official acknowledgement is slow or incomplete, and the actual fix or workaround tends to come from the affected community rather than from Microsoft moving with real urgency. Let's talk about what the workaround situation actually looks like for developers affected by these specific bugs, because it follows a familiar shape too. Community troubleshooting threads on Microsoft's own developer forums and on independent sites tracking WSL issues documented the mirrored networking failures in detail well before Microsoft's official channels caught up, with clear guidance, with developers sharing manual configuration workarounds, adjusting network adapter settings, rolling back specific updates, switching to alternate networking modes to restore VPS and VPN connectivity in the meantime. Some developers reported reverting to WSL1's older, simpler networking model entirely, sacrificing some of a WSL2's performance. Advantages just to get a stable connection back while waiting for an official fix. That's become close to a running theme across every story like this one. The people actually affected by a Microsoft product regression end up doing real-time diagnostic work and sometimes accepting a worse performing configuration as a stopgap that ideally should have been unnecessary if Microsoft's own testing process had caught the regression before it ever shipped to the public. So where does this leave things for developers trying to decide whether WSL is still worth relying on for serious work? Now, the honest answer, again, is nuanced rather than a clean verdict either way. WSL remains a genuinely useful, actively developed tool, and Microsoft's stated commitment to improving its performance and reliability, whatever the underlying strategic motivation, could result in real improvements if it's followed through consistently. But genuinely useful when it's working, and reliable enough to depend on without regularly checking for the latest breaking update are two different standards, and the last year of WSL's update history has clearly failed to meet the second one. For developers who specifically chose WSL because dual booting or fully switching to Linux felt like more disruption than they wanted, watching the one tool built to avoid that disruption fail twice in 2 months, while Microsoft's own leadership simultaneously signals a future built around AI agents rather than basic reliability, is exactly the kind of experience that makes a full switch to native Linux start looking like less of a compromise and more of a relief. It's worth thinking about the specific irony sitting at the center of this entire situation, because it's sharper than it might first appear. While WSL exists specifically to reduce the friction of leaving Windows, to let developers get everything they'd want from a Linux environment without actually installing Linux as their primary operating system, every time that specific tool breaks in a way that disrupts real professional work, it doesn't just create a temporary inconvenience. It quietly erodes the exact value proposition WSL was built to deliver in the first place, which is reliability and convenience good enough that switching operating systems entirely never feels necessary. A WSL that breaks twice in 2 months isn't neutral in this equation. It's actively pushing affected developers a step closer to the exact outcome it was designed to prevent. At the same moment, Microsoft's own public messaging about the platform's future is pushing many of those same developers in the same direction for entirely separate reasons. If you're a developer who's hit either of these WSL networking bugs, or you are one of the people replying to Davalery's original Agentic OS post, let me know in the comments what actually pushed you toward considering Linux, if anything. That kind of real, specific frustration is worth more than any single video's analysis, this one included. And if you want the fuller picture of why this pattern keeps repeating across Microsoft's own products, I've got the other stories we've covered on this channel linked right here. The team's lockout on Linux, the secure boot certificate mess, Copilot's broken sidebar on Edge for Linux, because taken together, they paint a much clearer picture of a company that keeps promising better Linux support while its own testing process keeps failing to deliver it. It's the same shape every time. Real, credible commitments made publicly, followed by execution that falls short in exactly the area those commitments covered, followed by a community that ends up doing the diagnostic work Microsoft's own testing should have caught first. Subscribe if you want to keep watching exactly where the next crack in that promise shows up, because based on this pattern, 4 separate incidents in 8 months on this one tool alone, it's not likely to be the last one.